By the winter of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. From the east, the Red Army thundered across the Vistula. From the west, British and American bombers darkened the skies every night, turning cities into oceans of fire. The Luftwaffe, once master of Europe's skies, was now a shadow of its former self. Its airfields were ruins, its fuel nearly gone, and its best pilots long dead. Yet in the final months of the war, from desperation was born one last audacious plan: Operation Gisela. In early March 1945, in the dimly lit bunkers of the Luftwaffe's Night Fighter Command, General Josef Kammhuber issued orders that seemed torn from the pages of an earlier war. It was to be a massive night assault, not on German soil, but deep inside Allied airspace. The idea was bold. Hundreds of Ju-88 and Bf-110 night fighters would shadow returning RAF bomber streams across the North Sea, following them home to England. Once over their bases, they would strike, low, fast, and unseen. It would be a raid against the hunters themselves. For the German crews, it sounded like suicide. Britain's skies were now guarded by radar, searchlights, and night fighters of their own, but the order was clear: attack the enemy at his home, destroy his bombers on their own airfields, and show the world the Luftwaffe still fights. As dusk fell on March 3, 1945, the night fighter bases along northern Germany came alive for what would be the last time. Mechanics worked in near darkness, patching bullet holes, checking fuel lines, and loading belts of 20mm ammunition. The air was thick with the smell of oil and exhaustion. Pilots gathered in briefing rooms, faces pale in the red light of lamps, listening to the mission outline. There was no cheer, no swagger, only silence. Each man knew what awaited them beyond the North Sea. Outside, engines roared to life. The deep, throaty growl of Junkers Umo engines echoed through the frozen airfields. Frost sparkled on the wings of the night fighters as ground crews saluted. One by one, the black-painted aircraft lifted into the night, ghostly silhouettes rising against the moonlit clouds. From Flensburg, Venlo, Stade, and Wunstorf, the sky filled with dark shapes headed west. At 2200 hours, they crossed the German coast, flying low over the dark sea. Below them, the water was calm and cold, glimmering faintly in the moonlight. Radio silence was absolute. Only the steady hum of the engines and the faint creak of the fuselage broke the stillness. Somewhere ahead, the great stream of RAF Lancasters returning from another raid on the Ruhr moved like a river of silver through the clouds. The German pilots could see them now, faint glints of light as bombers reflected moonlight on their wings, tiny pinpricks stretching to the horizon. There were hundreds of them. The Germans eased closer, throttling back to avoid detection. For hours they flew among the enemy, invisible and waiting. Over the radio, whispered voices crackled. The code word passed from plane to plane. Gisela beginnt. Gisela begins. Then chaos erupted. Over the North Sea, German night fighters dove into the bomber stream, cannons flashing in the dark. Tracer fire streaked across the sky like burning rain. One Lancaster exploded in a bloom of flame, its pieces falling into the black water below. Another spiraled downward, engines screaming before vanishing into the waves. British gunners fired wildly into the night, blind to where the attack came from. But this was only the beginning. The real objective lay ahead: England itself. Following the bomber streams inland, the German fighters crossed the coastline of Norfolk and Yorkshire. Below them, the faint lights of English towns flickered in the blackout. The men gripped their controls tighter. They were now flying over the enemy's home, at treetop level, at night, in total radio silence. One mistake meant death. Searchlights suddenly swept the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries roared to life. The British radar network had spotted them. Intruders over East Anglia, came the warning across RAF radio frequencies. Sirens wailed across airfields from Norwich to Lincolnshire as ground crews scrambled to defend their bases. The Germans pressed on, diving low over hedgerows and villages, engines howling. Some pilots could see their targets ahead, rows of RAF bombers landing or taxiing in the dark. They opened fire with everything they had. Explosions lit the runways. Bombers caught fire where they sat. For a few brief burning minutes, chaos reigned over England's airfields, but the trap was closing. British Mosquito night fighters were already in the air, hunting the intruders. One by one, the German raiders began to fall, caught by radar, shot down, or crashing into the ground after being blinded by their own muzzle flashes. Flames lit the English countryside as aircraft on both sides burned. By dawn, the survivors were limping home, low on fuel, engines coughing. Of the hundreds who had taken off, many never returned. Operation Gisela had lasted just a few hours, but it was unlike anything seen before or ever again. The night sky above England was alive with chaos. It was just after midnight on March 4th, 1945, and for the first time in years, the war had come roaring back over the British countryside. The people of Norfolk, Yorkshire, and Lincolnshire woke to the sound of engines, not the familiar steady rumble of their own returning bombers, but something lower, faster, more menacing. German night fighters, sleek and black, were sweeping in low over the fields, unseen until their guns erupted. From the coast to the Midlands, searchlights clawed at the darkness, anti-aircraft batteries opened fire blindly, their tracers arcing upward in frantic streaks of light. Dogs barked, sirens wailed. RAF personnel, exhausted after a long night's raid on Germany, ran for cover as the once silent airfields turned into infernos. At RAF Hemswell, bombers were just returning from the skies above the Ruhr. Their crews, drained and shivering, thought the night's danger was behind them. Then came the sound, a deep growl rising fast. Seconds later, a Ju-88 streaked over the tree line, its cannons flashing red in the blackness. The rounds tore through the landing strip, striking a Lancaster that had just touched down. The bomber exploded in a sphere of fire, the blast lighting up the field like daylight. The German pilot banked low, pulling up over the burning wreckage. Tracer fire chasing him as he disappeared into the night. Within moments, more attackers followed, each sweeping in from the dark, striking and vanishing before the defenders could react. At RAF Elsham Wolds, one witness later described the scene as hell on earth. Bombers burned where they stood, hangars collapsed in flames, mechanics and ground crews scrambled for their lives as explosions rolled across the airfield. It was an ambush, unexpected, surgical, and terrifyingly precise. For a few brief minutes, the Luftwaffe was back, a ghost army rising one last time from the ashes of defeat. Over the radio, the RAF's intruder warning system crackled to life. Enemy aircraft over Lincolnshire, multiple contacts, engage at once. Mosquito night fighters scrambled from every available base. The hunters had become the hunted. The German pilots pressed deeper into enemy territory. At RAF Bodisford, at RAF Metheringham, and at RAF Cottesmore, explosions lit the sky. Air crews sprinted from their bunks to man anti-aircraft guns. The confusion was total. In the flickering light of burning aircraft, shadows darted across the fields, men shouting, engines roaring, tracer rounds cutting through smoke and darkness. Over Yorkshire, a formation of Ju-80s flying low over the Humber was intercepted by a pair of mosquitoes. A deadly dance began among the clouds. The mosquitoes were faster and lighter, their twin engines screaming as they closed in. One Ju-88 banked sharply, its pilot trying to disappear into the cloud cover. But it was too late. The British fighters' cannons roared. The Ju-88 burst into flame, diving into the Black Sea below. Farther south, near RAF Waddington, another Ju-88 strafed the runway, riddling parked bombers with cannon fire. Its gunners shouted as tracer fire from the ground stitched across the fuselage. The aircraft shuddered, one engine trailing smoke. With a final burst of speed, it climbed, turned toward the coast, and vanished into the night, disappearing into history. All across eastern England, the pattern repeated: sudden violence, burning wreckage, and silence. In less than an hour, the raiders had struck more than 20 airfields. Dozens of bombers were destroyed on the ground. Others crashed on takeoff as panicked crews tried to escape. Civilians watched from windows and cellars as streaks of fire crossed the night sky, the echoes of war returning to the homeland once more. But even as the attacks raged, the Luftwaffe's old curse returned: fuel. Many of the German fighters had barely enough to reach England, attack, and turn back. Some ran dry before even finding a target. One by one, engines began to sputter. Pilots turned east, hoping to find their way home through darkness and flak. A Bf-110 limped across the North Sea, its wings holed, the crew wounded. The navigator stared at his instruments, the compass flickering weakly. Behind them, the sky still glowed from the fires they'd left behind. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to believe they'd done something meaningful, that they had shown the world the Luftwaffe still lived. But for most, home would never come. Dozens of German aircraft went down in the dark waters of the North Sea, out of fuel, shot down by British fighters, or destroyed in crashes upon landing. Those who survived returned to airfields now half ruined, their comrades gone, their country falling apart around them. Operation Gisela had struck terror into Britain's night, but at a cost that could never be repaid. As dawn broke over northern England, the fires were still burning. The airfields smoldered, the ground blackened. Crews walked among the wrecks of their bombers, faces blank with shock. Some stared at the twisted remains of their friends' aircraft, the same men they had flown beside hours earlier. The attack was over, but its echoes would last a lifetime. In the cold light of morning, the RAF counted their losses and began to understand what had happened. The Luftwaffe, beaten, bleeding, and dying, had somehow found the strength for one last strike. One last reminder that even in defeat, Germany's warriors could still make the night burn. The dawn of March 4th, 1945, was gray and cold over the North Sea. The storm clouds were low, the wind biting, and the horizon blurred between sea and sky. Out there, in that endless gray, the survivors of Operation Gisela were trying to come home. Engines coughed and sputtered as the Luftwaffe night fighters limped eastward, many flying on fumes. Their instruments flickered, fuel gauges pinned to zero. The long black shapes of Ju-80s and Bf-100s skimmed just above the waves, their paint scarred, bullet holes punched through wings and fuselage. Inside, the crews were silent, their oxygen was low, their nerves were raw. They had fought their last battle. Some of them had seen England burning beneath them, their guns still smoking as they turned for home. Others had barely escaped the night, chased by British mosquitoes, blinded by searchlights, or crippled by flak. A few flew alone now, radios dead, navigation ruined, praying the storm would break long enough to see the German coast. But for many, there would be no return. At 5:30 hours, radar stations along the Frisian Islands began picking up faint signals, friendly aircraft trying to find their way back. Some were calling out distress codes, their voices cracking with static. Low fuel, engine failing, ditching, then silence. One by one, the blips disappeared from the screens. Out over the sea, small fires burned on the waves, aircraft that had gone down in darkness, their fuel tanks erupting as they hit the water. Crews who survived the crash found themselves in freezing water, the wreckage of their planes drifting beside them. Some tried to inflate dinghies, others clung to debris. The wind howled. The sea took them quickly. Those who made it home found their airfields waiting, cold, quiet, and nearly empty. At Stade, the first survivors touched down just after sunrise, their landing gear scraping across runways covered in frost. Mechanics ran forward as crippled aircraft rolled to a stop, engines dying with a final sputter. Men climbed out slowly, faces black with oil, eyes hollow. There were no cheers, only exhaustion. At Wunstorf, the returning Ju-88s taxied past empty hangars and burned-out trucks. Ground crews counted them one by one. The realization spread like a chill. Most of the aircraft were missing. Of the hundreds that had taken off, only a fraction returned. Some squadrons had been wiped out entirely. Inside the control bunkers, officers studied casualty lists in silence. The maps that once showed the proud reach of the Luftwaffe were now nothing but a memory. What had begun as one final strike had ended as a funeral in the sky. For the men who survived, the stories would never fade. One pilot, Oberleutnant Heinrich Bremer, recalled the moment his fuel light came on halfway across the sea. He throttled back, hoping to make the coast. His navigator said nothing, just watched the horizon, the glow of fires fading behind them. When they finally saw the faint line of land ahead, they both wept in relief. Moments later, the right engine failed. They crashed just short of the airfield, the aircraft breaking apart in the snow. Bremer survived. His navigator did not. For others, the ending was even quieter. Aircraft came in too low, clipping treetops, skidding across frozen runways, bursting into flames. Medics pulled burned men from wreckage, their bodies wrapped in smoke and ice. There were no headlines, no medals, only the bitter truth that it had all been for nothing. By mid-morning, the reports reached Berlin. Operation Gisela had destroyed around 30 RAF bombers, a small victory, bought with the lives of more than 100 Luftwaffe airmen and dozens of lost aircraft. For the High Command, it was a gesture of defiance, a final message that Germany could still strike back. But for the men who flew it, it was simply the end. As the sun rose higher, the airfields of northern Germany fell silent. Mechanics walked among the wrecks, their boots crunching on frost. The hangars were cold, the smell of burned fuel and death hung heavy. A few surviving aircraft stood in line, engines ticking as they cooled, ghosts of a vanished force. From the east came distant thunder, artillery from the approaching Red Army. The war was closing in on every side. For the Luftwaffe, there would be no more missions like this one. The sky that had once belonged to them was now the enemy's domain. That afternoon, the remaining pilots gathered in the mess hall. No one spoke of the night before. Some drank in silence, others stared at the floor. They had flown into history, a desperate, doomed charge against impossible odds. As darkness fell again over the shattered airfields, the last of the damaged planes were dragged into hangars. Some would never fly again. Others would be destroyed days later when Soviet tanks arrived. Operation Gisela had ended, not with victory, not with glory, but with silence. By March's end, 1945, Germany was dying. Cities lay in ruins, railways twisted and broken, skies filled not with German wings but with Allied bombers passing unopposed. The once mighty Luftwaffe that had conquered the skies of Europe in 1940 now existed only in fragments, scattered squadrons of exhausted men, their aircraft patched together with salvaged parts, their fuel measured in buckets. Operation Gisela had been their final howl in the dark. What remained was only the silence of defeat. Across the airfields of northern Germany, the wreckage of the returning night fighters still lay scattered. Some were half buried in mud, others burned to empty shells. Mechanics walked between them with hollow eyes, searching for anything still usable, a propeller, a radio, a scrap of metal. Every resource was gone. Even the oxygen systems had been stripped for parts. The war had consumed everything, even its own weapons. At Wunstorf, the base that had launched dozens of night fighters into the black sky of March 3rd, the survivors stood for a group photograph. There were only 12 of them left from nearly 50 who had taken off that night. Their faces were blank, wind-burned, older than their years. They did not smile. Behind them, the hangars stood empty, the doors swinging in the cold spring wind. It was the last photo taken of their unit. A week later, Allied fighters strafed the field and destroyed what was left. In Berlin, the reports from Operation Gisela reached the high command. The numbers told the truth. Only a handful of bombers destroyed, more than 100 of their own aircraft lost or missing. The official communiques called it a successful intruder raid. But the officers knew better. It had been brave, desperate, and utterly hopeless. A gesture, nothing more. Still, for the men who had flown it, there was meaning in the act. To them, Gisela had not been about victory. It had been about defiance. They had looked into the face of inevitable defeat and chosen to fight anyway. In the darkness over England, they had been warriors again, if only for a few hours. As the weeks passed, the war closed in. In April, Allied forces crossed the Rhine, and the Red Army reached the suburbs of Berlin. The Luftwaffe's airfields were overrun one by one. Pilots who had flown through years of war now found themselves burning their own aircraft to keep them from capture. The black-painted Ju-80s and Bf-100s and 10s, symbols of Germany's once feared night fighter arm, went up in flames on their own runways. Some pilots stood beside the wrecks, watching the smoke rise into the evening sky, their reflections flickering in the firelight. A few tried to flee south, hoping to surrender to the Americans. Others stayed behind, waiting for the Soviets. For many, the final act came quietly. Engines stripped, uniforms hidden, insignias torn away. The Luftwaffe, the great air weapon of the Reich, simply vanished. In the nights that followed, the skies over Germany were clearer than they had been in years. No flak, no bombers, no engines, just silence and stars. Those who survived often said that the silence was worse than the noise had ever been, because it meant that everything was over. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years was finished. Across the airfields of Europe, wrecked planes sat in rows, their wings torn, their canopies shattered. In the north, where Operation Gisela had begun, British troops found the abandoned bases. Inside the hangars, they discovered burned aircraft, flight logs still open on tables, coffee cups beside maps, cigarettes burned down to ash. It was as if time had stopped on the night of the last flight. In the years that followed, historians would call Operation Gisela the last gasp of the Luftwaffe. They were right, but they missed something deeper. For the men who flew it, that night was not about strategy or orders. It was about the bond of crews who had fought together since the early days, about duty to a cause they no longer believed in, but could not abandon. It was about refusing to fade quietly into the dark. In the end, that's what the night fighters were. Ghosts of a dying empire, flying into a sky that no longer belonged to them. They had been hunters once, stalking the bombers over Germany's burning cities. But on that final night, they became the hunted, chased through the very darkness they once ruled. Today, the fields where they took off are quiet. Grass grows through cracked runways, and the wind whispers over rusted fragments buried in the soil. Somewhere beneath that earth lie the remains of the last aircraft that flew in Germany's name. No memorial marks them, no monument bears their names. Only the sky remains, endless, empty, silent. But for a few brief hours in March 1945, that sky burned again. Against all reason, against all hope, the Luftwaffe rose once more and vanished into the dark.